Rashid Khalidi is here. He is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. No, the historian has explored the history of Palestinian nationalism as deeply and passionately as he has. His new book is called Sowing Crisis, the Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East. I am pleased to have him back at this table. We have much to do here, so let's get with it. This book was informed by your experience in Beirut in the 70s?
That is correct.
How so?
Well, I was living in a capital that was one of the cockpits of the Cold War in the Middle East. Right. I was living in Beirut, and the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in this fierce rivalry, and people take it for granted. They think of the Cold War as something that took place in Berlin or something that had to do with the Korean War, but the Middle East was one of the major arenas of American-Soviet competition, and it was getting hotter and hotter in the time I was there. And I realized this as I was working on this book, that this was the angle that I wanted to take.
So the angle is the fact that this conflict between superpowers
had an enormous impact on every conflict in the Middle East and on every government in the Middle East.
Does it still?
I would argue that it does.
The new administration going to make a difference with their diplomacy?
A lot will depend on how hard they re-examine every mistaken policy of the last 3 administrations. A lot will depend on how hard they look at what has to be done. Are they going to follow the same line of, for example, refusing under any circumstance to negotiate with half of the Palestinians? Or Hamas.
So, as we asked the questions, let me just go. Your recommendation is?
My recommendation is the United States should encourage a Palestinian unity government that would negotiate with Israel. And the United States should accept that unity government, and it should work for free elections, which will give you yet another unity government, hopefully.
And should it be conditional on the Hamas doing anything?
It should be conditional on that government accepting prior agreements and accepting to negotiate with Israel. I mean, what more do you ask? The prior agreements include recognition of Israel where Israel has not recognized Palestine. The prior agreements are unequal, unfair. I would tear them up if it were. Somebody should sit down and think a little bit about what has gone wrong. And it's not just, Iranian nuclear this or American that. These are things that go way back. The Iranians have deep feelings about their relationship with the United States, and we have to think about that. You may have noticed that just recently an Iranian official said the United States has to apologize for, I'm not even sure what. But that represents a genuine Iranian feeling. I'm not suggesting the United States should necessarily apologize for anything. But I think we have to look back and speak. The way that the president spoke in that interview on العربية to the Arab world, I think you have to figure out a way of speaking to the Iranians specific, a grand bargain. And I think that if you go back to the president's press conference, in which he mentioned, in answer to Helen Thomas's question about Israel's nuclear weapons, he mentioned non-proliferation. You have to tell the Iranians, we understand that you have fears, and that might be why you want nuclear weapons. How do we address those fears? Do we build down ours and the Russian nuclear arsenals and work towards nuclear disarmament in the Middle East, and in that context get guarantees that you'll never have nuclear weapons because others won't threaten you with theirs? 3 alternatives. Your first alternative is to go to war, or let the Israelis go to war, or encourage the Israelis to go to war. All of which options, I think, are probably the stupidest thing you could do and will lead to a catastrophic presidency for President Obama, and will not prevent Iran getting nuclear weapons. It'll guarantee Iran will get nuclear weapons, maybe a little later, and in a much angrier state. So you have that option. You or the Israelis have that option. Your second option is sanctions, harsh sanctions, up to the point of blockade, which is an act of war. I think might lead to the same result as the first one. If you tighten the sanctions enough, or you're blockading, say, gasoline going to Iran, they don't refine enough of the oil that they produce to fuel their own cars. And so one of the arguments that the hardline types, the hawks have made, the warmongers have made, is we should blockade Iranian gasoline. Well, that's your second option, is really harsh sanctions. It's not going to stop them. If they believe we're trying to bring their regime down, and they believe they're threatened, they're probably going to try and build nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying you can stop them, but I don't think sanctions are going to stop them, and I'm sure war won't stop them. What is your third option? Your third option is to try and negotiate with them. If they won't do it, you have to figure out how you're going to live with a nuclear Iran.
What's easier, dealing with Iran or creating, contributing to an Israeli-Palestinian peace? The creation of a Palestinian state and some kind of...
I honestly think dealing with Iran would actually be easier.
I do too.
I actually think that you could probably get a grand bargain with them. You might even prevent them from getting... You know, I actually think Turkey has shown that a medium-sized power, so has Qatar, actually, can sometimes do more than Europeans, Russians, Americans, Chinese, major powers.
Tell me why, because I believe that true.
Well, this government, this Turkish government, obviously thinks that it has I don't want to say a mission, but it has a vocation for dealing with countries in the Middle East.
Right.
That it is able to talk to them, and it's shown that it can do it successfully. I mean, it's done it with the Syrians and the Israelis. It's done it in Lebanon, helping to broker that accord in May of last year, of 2008, after the country almost tumbled into civil war. They and the Qataris have been more effective than American diplomacy. So I actually think that the Turks could play an enormous role in several of these things.
And the Arab nations are doing what? And what do they want? And how do they get more involved?
The Arab nations are in a pitiful state. You have governments, several regimes in the Arab world today that are facing quite serious succession issues. Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Their public opinion is not in the same place as their decision makers. They have big middle classes and other groups that really want representation, and they're not allowed it. They're not democratic governments. And so these are governments under great stress. The economic crisis.
In the interview that the president did with Al Araba, is it possible that, you know, a president who looks at these big issues through fresh eyes, you know, can transcend whatever, all the impediments that have been there, that somehow it is possible, because no nation wants to live in conflict, fear?
It's possible. It's possible. The president is going to have to take a decision that this is something that his administration wants to achieve, and it's willing to pay a certain price and exert itself. He's made a couple of really quite extraordinary appointments so far, in Senator Mitchell, in Ambassador Freeman as the head of the National Intelligence Council, in General Jones. These are people who know the Middle East pretty well. Ambassador Freeman served in Saudi Arabia.
How about
General Jones.
Ambassador Holbrooke?
Ambassador Holbrooke. I'm talking about Arab. I was talking about Arab-Israeli.
Right.
I mean, these are people who have experience with that. Ambassador Holbrooke is extremely experienced, obviously. So, you know, he has the expertise there. It's going to require an enormous leap, though. It's going to be very hard, and he has to have domestic support for it, and that means people speaking up on this. Look at the way in which the conflict in Gaza was treated by most of the American media and most American politicians. This was a conflict in which wanton aggression was inflicted on poor Israel, and Israel was forced to respond. The fact that 1,300 people were killed on one side and 13 were killed on the other side doesn't seem to have affected anybody. The fact that, you know, this huge war machine was operating on 139 square miles where 1.5 million people were cooped up. Nobody in Congress, except now Congressman Baird, Congressman Ellison, and Senator Kerry, who actually went there and saw that pretty much everything Congress and the media had been saying had very little relation to reality. A lot of people have sensed this, and people have to speak out on it.
Yeah, I think people always saw the scale of the destruction in Gaza. That was clear. Did they not?
Well, they were prevented from doing so by not having American and foreign journalists there. It was really hard. They figured it out since. Yeah, they have. But it's not just that. It's that there are two sides to this story, and the United States has to solve the problem. It doesn't have to take one side. If we take the side of the Israelis, which is the recommendation of our Congress, for example, there's not going to be settlement. There's not going to be a resolution. There's going to be suffering there years from now. We're not going to solve this by doing pretty much anything the Israelis want us to do.